The security footage would later show exactly 10.3 seconds. That's how long it took Diane Scott to field strip, clean, and reassemble a military-grade M249 SAW machine gun using nothing but muscle memory and 12 years of specialized training that nobody at Blackstone Defense Contractors knew she possessed. But the cameras couldn't capture the months of systematic surveillance she'd conducted from behind her reception desk, or the moment she realized that the company's most classified weapons project was about to be stolen by the very people trusted to protect it. This is the story of how a woman dismissed as just the receptionist became the only thing standing between America's most advanced military technology and foreign operatives, who had spent 2 years infiltrating one of the nation's most secure defense facilities. It's about the moment when hidden expertise met deadly betrayal, and why sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the one you need when national security hangs in the balance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the reinforced concrete facade of Blackstone Defense Contractors as Diane Scott adjusted the visitor badge printer for the 3rd time that week. Someone had knocked it askew again, probably Dr. Marcus Webb from the engineering division, who had a habit of leaning across her workspace while discussing classified projects as if she were part of the furniture. The metal nameplate on her desk read simply, D. Scott Reception, though she'd been requesting facilities management for 8 months to update it with her full first name. Diane arrived every morning at 6:42 a.m., 18 minutes before her official start time, not because company policy required it, but because she understood something that most people in the defense industry had forgotten. Preparation prevents catastrophic failure. While the facility's skeleton crew completed their overnight maintenance protocols and the first wave of engineers stumbled through the lobby clutching coffee and reviewing technical specifications, she conducted her own systematic reconnaissance. First, she reviewed the overnight security incident reports, not because it was her responsibility, but because she'd noticed operational patterns that others consistently missed. Unusual after-hours access attempts by personnel who shouldn't need weekend facility time. Equipment delivery schedules that didn't align with active project timelines. Contractor personnel who seemed unfamiliar with standard military protocol despite claiming extensive defense industry experience. She documented these observations in a leather portfolio that she maintained as a personal security log, recording details that the official incident reports frequently overlooked or dismissed as routine anomalies. Then came the real intelligence work that remained invisible to her colleagues. Diane studied the facility's emergency response procedures, mentally calculating evacuation times for each sector during various threat scenarios. She memorized the security clearance levels of all personnel, tracking which engineers had access to which classified projects, which visitors were recurring consultants, and which delivery companies operated on predictable schedules that could be exploited by hostile actors. To everyone else, she was simply punctual. To Diane, she was conducting the kind of threat assessment that had kept her alive through 4 combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, where understanding your environment meant the difference between completing your mission and becoming a casualty statistic. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a facility filled with weapons designers, security analysts, and military contractors, she was the only person who actually understood the building's operational vulnerabilities from both a technical and tactical perspective. But understanding threats and having those assessments taken seriously were entirely different challenges in the corporate defense world. "Morning, Di," called Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison as he breezed past her desk without slowing his stride. Harrison served as Blackstone's military liaison, a position that required coordinating between civilian engineers and active-duty personnel who tested the company's weapons systems. He'd been shortening her name for 2 years despite her polite corrections, and she'd stopped trying to educate him about basic courtesy. Diane had learned to absorb these casual dismissals without visible reaction. In her previous career, the one nobody at Blackstone knew about, showing emotional responses to disrespect could compromise operational security and endanger your entire unit. Now it just meant the difference between maintaining professional relationships and being labeled as difficult to work with in an industry where reputation determined career advancement. "Good morning, Colonel Harrison," she replied with the same professional courtesy she extended to everyone, regardless of how they treated her. "Your 9:15 briefing with the Navy procurement team has been moved to Conference Room Alpha. They requested the secure facility for their presentation." Harrison paused, actually making eye contact for the first time in weeks. How did you know about the room change? That notification just came through classified channels 20 minutes ago. I coordinate with all department heads every morning, Diane explained patiently. When the Navy team's advanced security called to request enhanced electronic countermeasures for their meeting space, I cross-referenced it with today's scheduled briefings and contacted your office to confirm the new arrangements. For a moment, Harrison looked genuinely surprised, as if the concept that his receptionist might proactively solve complex logistical problems had never occurred to him. Then his expression returned to its usual dismissive neutrality. Right. Well, good work. Keep doing whatever that was. He disappeared toward the elevator bank, leaving Diane with the familiar sensation of being momentarily visible before returning to her default state of professional invisibility. She'd grown accustomed to this treatment, the way people's attention would pass over her as if she were part of the office infrastructure, how sensitive conversations would continue around her as if she couldn't comprehend anything beyond basic administrative functions, the automatic assumption that because she managed visitor access and answered phones, she couldn't possibly understand the complex technical and security matters that defined Blackstone's operations. What they didn't know was that Master Sergeant Diane Scott had spent 12 years in Army Ordnance Corps before a roadside IED in Kandahar ended her military career and left her with a slight hearing loss in her left ear that most civilians never noticed. They didn't know she held advanced certifications in weapons systems maintenance, explosive ordnance disposal, and small arms instruction. They didn't know she spoke fluent Arabic and Pashto, or that she could identify potential security threats through behavioral analysis techniques learned during multiple deployments in hostile environments. Most importantly, they didn't know she'd taken this particular job specifically because it offered something her military career had never provided: the ability to observe potential threats while remaining completely invisible to both colleagues and adversaries who might be conducting surveillance of their own. The lobby began filling with the morning influx of engineers, project managers, and visiting military personnel as Diane settled into what appeared to be routine reception duties. She processed security badges with crisp efficiency, directed visitors to appropriate departments, and managed delivery logistics while maintaining the pleasant, unremarkable demeanor that made her effectively invisible to most people who passed through the facility. But beneath this administrative facade, she was conducting continuous threat assessment. The Navy contractor who'd spent 12 minutes examining the lobby's security camera positions while claiming to wait for his escort. The facility's maintenance supervisor who'd asked unusually detailed questions about weekend security protocols during routine work order coordination. The new janitorial staff member who'd been hired without the standard background verification process and seemed unfamiliar with basic cleaning procedures. Diane logged these observations in her personal security portfolio, documenting details that trained security professionals might dismiss as coincidental or irrelevant. Her experience had taught her that the most dangerous threats often emerged from patterns that looked routine until viewed as part of a larger operational picture. Around 10:30 a.m., she noticed something that made her pen freeze mid-sentence. 3 men in Navy contractor uniforms were examining the weapons testing facility access points with unusual methodical attention. Their credentials appeared legitimate: proper insignia, correct uniform specifications, appropriate identification badges displayed on regulation lanyards. But their behavior was wrong in ways that only someone with extensive military experience would recognize. Genuine military contractors moved with purposeful efficiency, focused on specific objectives, and familiar with standard security procedures. These men kept scanning the facility layout, noting sight lines and secondary access routes. One of them was photographing security camera positions with a device concealed in what appeared to be a standard tablet computer. Diane continued her reception duties while tracking their movement through peripheral vision and reflective surfaces strategically positioned around the lobby. When one of them approached her desk, she looked up with the same professional smile she offered to all visitors. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that she immediately identified as Eastern European, possibly Croatian or Serbian. "We're conducting security assessments for the Navy contracts today. Are there any special access restrictions or VIP visits scheduled that might affect our work?" The question sounded reasonable to anyone unfamiliar with military protocol, but it was precisely the wrong question. Legitimate security assessments were coordinated through multiple command levels and wouldn't require information from reception personnel. Real contractors already knew about access restrictions through their security briefings. "You'll need to coordinate directly with our military liaison office on the 3rd floor," Diane replied smoothly. "Colonel Harrison handles all contractor security arrangements." The man's smile remained unchanged, but something shifted behind his eyes, a micro-expression she'd learned to recognize during interrogation training. "Of course. We just thought we'd check, since you seem to know everything that happens around here." After they moved away, Diane made a precise entry in her security log. 3 Navy contractors, 10:33 a.m., requesting inappropriate operational information. Recommend immediate verification of work orders through proper military channels. She knew her recommendation would likely be ignored or dismissed as excessive caution. During her 2 years at Blackstone, her security observations had been politely filed away as overly detailed administrative notes. The facility's official security team operated under the assumption that their electronic surveillance systems and military-grade physical barriers provided adequate protection against realistic threats. But Diane had seen enough combat operations to understand that the most successful attacks were often conducted by adversaries who looked exactly like legitimate personnel until the moment they revealed their true intentions. She'd learned to trust the instinctive recognition of operational patterns that indicated hostile surveillance, even when everyone around her insisted that everything appeared normal. As the morning progressed, and the lobby filled with the usual flow of engineers, contractors, and military personnel, Diane maintained her alert observation. To anyone watching, she was simply performing standard reception duties, managing visitor logs, coordinating with various departments, processing security badge requests. In reality, she was conducting the kind of environmental threat assessment that had been essential for survival during multiple combat deployments in environments where distinguishing between legitimate personnel and hostile operatives could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Because Diane Scott understood something that her colleagues had forgotten in their climate-controlled offices and scheduled project meetings. The world was full of adversaries who saw opportunity in other people's assumptions about safety and routine. And sometimes the person everyone dismissed as just the receptionist was the only one maintaining the vigilance necessary to detect when those assumptions became deadly vulnerabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elevator chimed its arrival at the executive level, and Diane watched through the lobby's security monitors as Blackstone's power structure emerged into their domain of bulletproof glass offices and classified project briefing rooms. From her position behind the reception desk, she had access to the facility's internal surveillance system, officially for visitor tracking purposes, but she'd learned to read the corporate dynamics through body language and territorial behaviors that played out on those screens. Dr. Amanda Richardson, Blackstone's chief technology officer, stepped out first, her steel gray heels clicking against polished concrete with military precision. She moved like someone who had never questioned whether a security clearance would be approved, whether a research budget would be funded, or whether her technical assessments would be implemented without debate. Behind her followed 2 senior project managers, their postures carefully calibrated to show deference without appearing subordinate, a delicate balance in the defense contracting world where technical expertise and military rank created complex hierarchies. "Diane." Dr. Richardson's voice carried the particular tone reserved for support personnel, not hostile, but establishing clear operational boundaries. "I need you to reschedule my 2:30 with the Air Force procurement team. Something more critical has developed." Diane pulled up Dr. Richardson's calendar on her secure terminal, already anticipating what she'd discover. The Air Force meeting had been scheduled for 6 weeks, involved 3 different military branches, and represented a potential $47 million contract for next-generation targeting systems. The something more critical was likely a lunch meeting with her former MIT research partner who was visiting from Boston, an appointment that had appeared on Richardson's personal calendar just that morning. "Certainly, Dr. Richardson, the Air Force team specifically requested this time slot to accommodate their testing schedule at Eglin Air Force Base. Would you prefer I suggest alternative dates, or shall I see if Dr. Martinez can serve as the primary technical contact?" Dr. Richardson paused, her expression shifting slightly as she realized Diane had just highlighted the complexity of what she'd assumed was a simple scheduling change. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing irritation at being reminded that her decisions affected carefully coordinated military operations involving multiple commands and significant resources. "Just handle it," Richardson said finally, waving her hand dismissively. "You're good at making these logistics work somehow." The backhanded compliment landed with familiar sting. Diane was indeed skilled at making complex arrangements work, at coordinating between military procurement schedules and civilian research timelines, at solving problems that required both technical understanding and diplomatic finesse. But in Richardson's worldview, being good at making things work was simply what you expected from support staff, not recognition of professional competence that deserved acknowledgement or career advancement. As Dr. Richardson disappeared into her secure office, Diane began the intricate process of salvaging a multi-million-dollar military contract. She started with a call to Master Sergeant Kelly Chen at Eglin Air Force Base, a fellow veteran who Diane had cultivated as a professional contact through months of coordination. "Kelly, it's Diane Scott at Blackstone. I have a scheduling crisis, but I think we can solve it together if you're willing to be flexible." 40 minutes and 6 phone calls later, Diane had restructured the entire procurement meeting to accommodate 4 different military schedules, arranged for satellite uplink testing that would allow real-time demonstration of the targeting systems, and coordinated technical support that would enable the Air Force team to conduct field testing that hadn't been possible under the original meeting structure. The procurement team would actually receive more comprehensive technical evaluation than originally planned, and the contract discussions could now include decision-makers from Special Operations Command who hadn't been available for the original briefing. But when Dr. Richardson emerged from her office an hour later, her only comment was, "Good, I knew you'd sort that out somehow." No acknowledgement of the complexity involved. No recognition that Diane had just transformed Richardson's thoughtless schedule change into a potential competitive advantage for Blackstone. Just the casual assumption that problems would disappear when delegated to competent subordinates whose capabilities remained invisible. This pattern repeated itself daily throughout Blackstone's facility. Diane observed it through security cameras, overheard it in classified phone conversations, and experienced it directly in countless interactions with executives who seemed to believe their success was entirely self-generated, independent of the support systems that actually enabled their work. Consider Dr. Robert Hawthorne, Blackstone's head of weapons systems development. He built his reputation on designing innovative small arms modifications and predicting military procurement trends, but he routinely ignored the most basic operational security protocols. He left classified technical specifications on his desk overnight, propped open secure doors for personal convenience, and discussed sensitive project details in elevators where anyone could overhear, including potentially hostile foreign nationals who might be conducting industrial espionage. Last month, Diane had noticed a troubling pattern in Dr. Hawthorne's behavior. He'd been working late 3 nights per week, always on the same schedule, always exiting through the parking structure entrance that had the least comprehensive surveillance coverage. His routine was so predictable that anyone conducting surveillance could easily anticipate his movements and identify opportunities for approach or compromise. Diane had drafted a detailed security assessment outlining her observations and suggesting minor schedule variations that would improve his personal operational security without disrupting his research productivity. She'd submitted it through proper channels, noting that as someone with extensive military experience in hostile environments, she'd identified vulnerability patterns that might warrant attention from security professionals. The response came back 3 days later through Colonel Harrison. "Please remind reception staff that security assessments should be conducted by qualified security personnel. Ms. Scott should focus on her assigned administrative duties." But Dr. Hawthorne's predictable routine continued unchanged, and Diane continued to observe him creating vulnerabilities that trained weapons designers should have recognized immediately. The irony wasn't lost on her that a man paid extensively to develop defensive systems couldn't identify the security risks he was creating for himself and potentially for the classified projects under his supervision. The dismissive culture extended beyond individual interactions into Blackstone's entire organizational structure. During monthly security briefings, Diane was expected to attend but not participate. She sat with other administrative personnel while executives discussed facility security, emergency procedures, and threat assessments, without ever soliciting input from the people who actually managed these systems on a daily basis. Last Tuesday's briefing had been particularly frustrating. The agenda included a presentation on new counter-surveillance procedures led by Director Thomas Morrison from Corporate Security. Morrison outlined protocols that looked comprehensive on paper but ignored several critical realities about how the facility actually functioned during different operational periods. Diane knew that the main personnel entrance couldn't handle a full facility evacuation efficiently because 2 of the 6 security checkpoints were routinely offline during maintenance windows that Morrison's procedures didn't account for. She knew that the classified materials storage area had access procedures that would create bottlenecks during emergency situations. She knew that the weapons testing facility had ventilation systems that could be compromised if emergency protocols weren't properly coordinated with ongoing experiments. But when Morrison asked if there were any questions or observations, Diane remained silent. Past experience had taught her that security professionals didn't appreciate corrections from administrative staff, regardless of how accurate those corrections might be, or how much military experience supported them. After the briefing, she overheard Morrison talking to Dr. Richardson in the hallway. "I think we've developed solid procedures. The beauty is that they're straightforward enough that even the support staff can follow them without getting confused during high-stress situations." The condescension was breathtaking. Morrison was discussing emergency procedures that could determine whether classified military technology fell into hostile hands during a crisis, and his primary concern was making them simple enough for people he assumed were less capable than himself. Diane had supervised facility evacuations in combat zones, where split-second decisions and detailed knowledge of local conditions were the only things preventing enemy forces from capturing critical intelligence assets. She understood that the most dangerous emergencies were often those that deviated from predicted patterns, requiring adaptability and situational awareness that couldn't be reduced to simple step-by-step procedures. But in Morrison's worldview, she was simply someone who processed visitor badges and couldn't be trusted to understand anything more complex than following basic instructions during a crisis. The pattern extended to seemingly minor interactions that accumulated into a constant background of professional dismissal, elevator conversations that stopped when she joined them, as if her presence meant the discussion was no longer secure, lunch invitations that never materialized despite 2 years of professional interaction with the same group of people, conference calls where she was introduced as Diane, who will be taking notes, rather than as someone who might contribute technical insights to the discussion. Even her attempts to build genuine professional relationships were subtly undermined by assumptions about her role and capabilities. When Sarah Martinez from the legal department complimented Diane's organizational abilities, she'd added, "You should consider taking some engineering courses at night. With your attention to detail, you might be able to move up to a project coordinator position eventually." The suggestion was meant encouragingly, but it revealed how completely Sarah had misunderstood Diane's actual qualifications. Diane held a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering with honors, plus advanced military certifications in weapons systems that most civilian engineers would never access. She'd managed complex ordnance operations involving millions of dollars in equipment and dozens of specialized personnel. But because she worked reception, people assumed she was at the beginning of a career ladder they'd mapped out for her based on their limited understanding of her capabilities. Perhaps most frustrating was how her military service was either ignored or misunderstood when colleagues learned about it. Some people seemed to think her Army experience was like an extended training program, valuable for teaching basic discipline and organization, but not particularly relevant to civilian defense contracting work. Others made awkward comments about her being tough enough to handle difficult visitors, reducing 12 years of specialized technical training to a personality characteristic. Nobody asked about her actual military specialization, her security clearance level, or the specific weapons systems expertise she'd developed. The assumption seemed to be that any experience sophisticated enough to transfer to corporate defense work would have led to a position more important than reception. As Diane managed the afternoon flow of calls, visitors, and minor coordination crises, she reflected on the peculiar blindness that seemed to affect otherwise intelligent people in the defense industry. They could design advanced weapons systems, negotiate complex military contracts, and manage multi-million-dollar research projects, but they couldn't see past their own assumptions about who deserved respect and who could be safely dismissed as unimportant. It was a dangerous blindness, she knew. In her experience, the people most likely to underestimate threats were those who'd never encountered serious consequences for their assumptions. And in a facility full of people who'd built their careers on developing military technology while remaining safely isolated from actual combat environments, that blindness could prove catastrophic if real threats ever materialized against targets they'd never learned to properly defend. Every evening at 6:45 p.m., exactly 12 hours after her arrival, Diane Scott secured her reception desk and began what appeared to be a routine end-of-shift procedure. She organized her workspace, exchanged polite farewells with the evening security staff, and gathered her belongings like any other defense contractor employee heading home after a long day. To casual observers, she was simply another administrative worker completing her daily responsibilities. But Diane's most important work was just beginning. Instead of proceeding directly to the employee parking structure, she took a calculated detour through Blackstone's sub-level facilities, areas that most employees never accessed and executives didn't know existed. The basement housed critical infrastructure, weapons storage vaults, classified material archives, advanced testing equipment, and service corridors that connected to every floor through maintenance tunnels and utility shafts. Diane had spent months mapping these spaces during her lunch breaks, claiming she was taking walks for exercise, while actually conducting reconnaissance that would have impressed her former Special Forces colleagues. Tonight, like every night for the past 8 weeks, she made her way to Sub-Level 3, where Blackstone's Night Shift Security Operations Center functioned behind unmarked reinforced doors. The evening security supervisor, Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, had completed 3 tours in Iraq before accepting the position at Blackstone. Unlike the day shift personnel who treated security as a routine administrative function, Rodriguez understood that effective protection required constant attention to patterns that others might dismiss as coincidental. "Evening, Diane," Rodriguez said, looking up from an array of monitors displaying feeds from cameras throughout the facility. "How were things upstairs today?" "Concerning," Diane replied, settling into the chair beside his workstation. "Those Navy contractors from this morning, did their credentials check out through proper channels?" Rodriguez's expression grew serious. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. I ran their security clearances through 3 different verification systems. The paperwork appears legitimate. Correct agency codes, proper authorization signatures, valid ID numbers, but something doesn't feel right." He pulled up a series of time-stamped surveillance images on his primary screen. "Look at this footage. They spent 97 minutes examining our weapons storage access protocols. Real Navy security assessors don't need that much time to evaluate standard procedures. They should already be familiar with DoD security requirements." Diane leaned forward, studying the images with trained analytical eyes. "What about their equipment manifests and technical specifications?" "Another red flag," Rodriguez said, advancing to additional footage. "Their scanning equipment was too sophisticated for routine security assessment. Advanced electromagnetic spectrum analyzers, communications intercept gear, electronic countermeasures devices. That's not standard assessment equipment. That's penetration testing gear designed to identify vulnerabilities for potential exploitation." Over the past 18 months, Diane and Rodriguez had developed an unofficial intelligence partnership that bridged the gap between her daytime observations and his nighttime security operations. While Blackstone's official security protocols operated through rigid bureaucratic structures and formal reporting chains, they'd created their own information network based on mutual military experience and shared recognition that traditional corporate security was inadequate against sophisticated threats. Rodriguez had identified Diane's background within days of her arrival, not through her personnel file, but through the way she moved, observed her environment, and conducted situational awareness. He'd been the first person at Blackstone to ask about her military service with genuine professional interest rather than polite curiosity. "Show me everything else you've collected," Diane said, preparing for their nightly intelligence review. Rodriguez opened a secure digital folder containing their joint documentation of suspicious activities over the past 3 months. Every unusual visitor, every deviation from established patterns, every security incident that day shift personnel had classified as routine business. They'd cataloged everything with the thoroughness of professionals, who understood that threats rarely announced themselves obviously. "The pattern is accelerating," Rodriguez said, indicating a timeline they'd constructed together. 6 weeks ago, we were documenting maybe 1 anomalous event per week. Now we're identifying suspicious activities almost daily." Diane reviewed their accumulated entries, each representing hours of careful observation and documentation. The lost delivery driver, who'd spent 28 minutes asking detailed questions about weekend staffing and emergency procedures. The telecommunications technician who'd requested access to areas that didn't match his stated work orders. The cleaning crew supervisor who'd been replaced without standard notification protocols and seemed unfamiliar with basic facility layouts. Individually, each incident could be explained as routine business confusion or minor administrative oversight. Collectively, they painted a clear picture of systematic intelligence gathering by hostile actors. "Look at this pattern analysis," Diane said, pointing to a series of entries from the past 10 days. "They're not collecting information randomly. They're specifically focused on weapons storage access, emergency response procedures, and security shift rotations. Someone is planning an operation that requires detailed knowledge of how this facility functions during crisis scenarios." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing, but try explaining that to Morrison's team upstairs. They're so focused on their electronic surveillance systems and bureaucratic procedures that they can't recognize threats that don't fit their predetermined categories." This represented the crucial difference between corporate security and military intelligence operations. Corporate security was designed to prevent common crimes, theft, unauthorized access, workplace violence. Military intelligence was designed to identify and counter sophisticated adversaries who adapted their methods to exploit defensive assumptions and organizational blind spots. Diane opened her personal security portfolio, the one she maintained as a comprehensive threat assessment tool. Inside were detailed facility diagrams she'd drawn from memory, annotated with information that no official building schematic contained, emergency exits that were frequently blocked by equipment storage, communication systems that failed during power fluctuations, weapons storage areas with sightlines that could be exploited by surveillance teams. "I've been developing comprehensive vulnerability assessments," she said, spreading her annotated diagrams across Rodriguez's desk. "If hostile actors wanted to target this facility, what would they need to succeed?" Together, they began analyzing Blackstone Defense Contractors not as a workplace but as a potential target for foreign intelligence services or terrorist organizations. Diane's military training had taught her to think like an adversary, to identify weaknesses that defenders might overlook, and to anticipate how threats might evolve beyond initial planning stages. "Access control is the primary challenge," Rodriguez said, studying her diagrams. "The main entrance security is comprehensive during business hours, multiple checkpoints, biometric verification, metal detection systems, but there are 14 different ways to enter this facility, without going through primary security." "Exactly," Diane replied, tracing alternative routes on her hand-drawn maps. "Service entrances, loading dock access, maintenance tunnels, emergency exits. Most rely on keycard systems that can be cloned or uniforms that can be replicated with proper intelligence preparation." They worked through various attack scenarios, testing their assumptions against the facility's actual defenses rather than theoretical security measures. What they discovered was troubling but predictable. Blackstone security was designed to look impressive and handle routine problems, but it contained multiple critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited by determined adversaries with adequate planning time. The weapons storage areas are actually the most vulnerable, Diane realized, tracing access routes on her diagrams. All the security focus is on preventing unauthorized personnel from reaching the storage vaults. But once someone gains access to the facility, there are fewer monitoring systems and more isolated areas where they could operate undetected. Rodriguez pulled up camera feeds from the weapons storage levels. "Look at these surveillance blind spots. Someone with detailed knowledge of our camera positions could move through significant portions of the storage facility without being recorded." As they worked through their threat assessment, Diane felt the familiar analytical rhythm that had sustained her through multiple combat deployments. The methodical gathering of intelligence, systematic evaluation of threats and vulnerabilities, development of response protocols for scenarios that others preferred not to consider. But there was a crucial difference between her military experience and her current situation. In the Army, her intelligence assessments had been valued, analyzed, and incorporated into operational planning by commanders who understood that accurate threat evaluation could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. At Blackstone, her insights were dismissed as excessive caution from support staff who didn't understand how sophisticated defense contractors really operated. "We need to document everything comprehensively," Diane said, making notes in her precise handwriting. "If something happens, we want complete records of the warning indicators that were available but ignored by official channels." Rodriguez agreed, but his expression reflected concern. "The question is whether anyone will listen if we try to escalate our findings through proper channels." Diane had been considering the same problem. Military intelligence operated through clear command structures, where threat assessments were taken seriously, regardless of their source, because combat environments taught people that accurate intelligence could come from unexpected sources, and that dismissing warnings often led to preventable disasters. Corporate environments seemed to filter information through politics and hierarchy, frequently dismissing valuable intelligence because it originated from people who weren't officially designated as security experts. "We focus on preparation," she decided. "We can't control whether other people take threats seriously, but we can control our own readiness to respond effectively if those threats materialize into actual attacks." Over the next 2 hours, they developed detailed response protocols for various emergency scenarios. Not the official evacuation procedures that Director Morrison had outlined in his briefings, but practical plans based on their intimate knowledge of how the facility actually functioned under stress and how hostile actors might exploit organizational assumptions during crisis situations. Diane's military training had taught her that the most effective security came not from preventing all possible attacks, but from being prepared to respond decisively when prevention systems failed. Her months of careful observation had given her insights into Blackstone's operational vulnerabilities that no security manual could provide, because those vulnerabilities emerged from the intersection of human behavior, organizational culture, and technological limitations. As their planning session concluded, Rodriguez compiled their findings into an encrypted file that he stored on a secure external drive. If something happens, this intelligence could make the difference between controlled response and complete organizational failure. Diane gathered her materials, returning her security portfolio to its disguise as routine administrative supplies. Tomorrow she would resume her role as Blackstone's invisible receptionist, processing visitor badges and managing coordination tasks while conducting surveillance that her colleagues couldn't imagine and wouldn't value if they knew about it. But tonight she felt the quiet satisfaction of a professional who had completed essential work that others wouldn't do, prepared for possibilities that others refused to consider, and maintained readiness that could prove crucial when preparation time ended and operational reality began. The facility settled into its nighttime operational rhythm around them, multiple levels of sleeping offices and secured laboratories where Blackstone's most advanced military technology waited under electronic surveillance and armed guards. Most employees were at home, confident that tomorrow would bring nothing more challenging than technical meetings, research coordination, and routine project management. Diane knew better. In her experience, the most dangerous threats were often those that developed gradually, gathering operational intelligence while defenders focused on familiar problems and comfortable assumptions about institutional security. And she was ready for whatever those threats might become. Thursday morning arrived with the deceptive normalcy that Diane had learned to distrust during her military deployments in active combat zones. At 6:42 a.m., she performed her standard arrival routine, but something in the facility's atmosphere felt different, subtle changes that only someone with extensive threat detection training would recognize. The first anomaly appeared at 8:47 a.m. when Blackstone's primary server network experienced what the IT department logged as a minor connectivity disruption. 4 of the 7 classified research terminals went offline simultaneously, their access protocols requiring manual authentication procedures that would take hours to restore. Director Morrison's security team classified it as routine technical maintenance, the kind of periodic system hiccup that occurred in any complex defense facility. But Diane noticed critical details that others missed. The server disruption had occurred during peak morning hours when maximum personnel traffic would create optimal cover for unauthorized activities. The affected terminals specifically controlled access to Project Nightfall, Blackstone's most classified weapons development program. The timing coincided perfectly with a scheduled shift change in the facility's security monitoring team. She made a precise entry in her security log: network systems compromised during optimal disruption window, coordinated with security personnel rotation. Pattern suggests intentional rather than accidental failure. At 9:23 a.m., the second warning sign materialized. A Department of Defense inspection team arrived in the lobby, presenting flawless credentials and work orders for conducting safety evaluations on Blackstone's weapons storage protocols. Their documentation was perfect: proper military letterhead, correct authorization codes, appropriate security clearances displayed on official identification. Diane processed their visitor registration with professional efficiency while conducting rapid threat assessment. The team leader, who introduced himself as Major William Kane from DoD Safety Compliance Division, projected the confident authority of someone accustomed to accessing secure military facilities. His three colleagues remained focused on their equipment cases, allowing Kane to handle all civilian interactions while they prepared for their stated inspection duties. But Kane made several critical errors that revealed the true nature of their mission. When Diane requested his military ID for verification against the visitor database, he produced it with a slight tremor in his left hand, a stress response she'd learned to recognize when people were using forged documentation. When she mentioned that all DoD inspections required advanced coordination with Colonel Harrison's office, Kane's facial expression showed relief rather than the mild frustration that legitimate inspectors typically displayed when encountering additional bureaucratic procedures. "Of course," Kane said smoothly, "we're familiar with proper military protocols. This evaluation requires access to multiple storage areas, so we appreciate Blackstone's security measures." Diane completed their registration while mentally cataloging additional observations. Kane's team carried equipment cases that moved with weight distribution inconsistent with standard inspection tools, suggesting specialized electronic gear beyond routine safety evaluation equipment. Two of his colleagues had positioned themselves to maintain visual surveillance of all lobby access points, a tactical arrangement rather than the focused preparation typical of safety inspectors. As the team disappeared into the elevator with Tommy Chen from Facilities Management, Diane immediately activated the discreet communication system she'd established with Rodriguez, a carefully worded text message that appeared to concern lunch coordination but actually transmitted Code Orange: multiple hostile actors confirmed in facility. Immediate investigation required. Rodriguez's response arrived within 90 seconds. Investigating now. Maintain normal operations. Meanwhile, Blackstone's routine Thursday operations continued around increasingly dangerous undercurrents. Dr. Richardson's research team was preparing for afternoon testing of their new targeting system prototypes. Dr. Hawthorne maintained his predictable schedule, following security protocols that Kane's team had likely been observing for weeks. The facility's normal rhythm provided perfect camouflage for hostile activities that appeared legitimate to everyone except the two people who'd been tracking suspicious patterns for months. At 10:17 a.m., Diane received a phone call that confirmed her worst fears about the developing situation. "Blackstone Defense Contractors, this is Diane speaking. How may I help you?" "Diane, this is Master Sergeant Kelly Chen at Eglin Air Force Base." The voice was strained, barely controlled urgency bleeding through military composure. "I need to speak with someone in command authority immediately. We've received very disturbing intelligence about your facility." Diane's combat training activated automatically when military personnel used phrases like disturbing intelligence and, quote, command authority. They were describing threats that they didn't know how to categorize through normal channels. "I'm connecting you to Colonel Harrison's office immediately. Can you provide any additional details that might help him prepare for your call?" Someone claiming to represent DoD Safety Division contacted our base commander directly using classified communication channels that should be restricted to authorized personnel. They had detailed knowledge about Project Nightfall specifications that were classified above their stated clearance level. They suggested that our scheduled inspection visit to Blackstone might encounter unexpected complications today. The implications struck Diane like physical blows. Eglin Air Force Base had been contacted by people with access to classified project information and restricted military communication systems. The callers had knowledge of Project Nightfall details that were compartmentalized beyond normal DoD access. Most critically, they'd warned about unexpected complications on the specific day when the most comprehensive weapons testing in Blackstone's history was scheduled to occur. "Kelly, I'm transferring you immediately. This information needs to reach our security team right away." But as Diane attempted to connect the call to Colonel Harrison's office, she discovered that Blackstone's internal communication system was experiencing temporary routing failures, the exact type of network disruption that could isolate different facility levels from each other during crisis situations. She tried Director Morrison's security office directly. The line rang 6 times before reaching an automated message system. She attempted to contact Rodriguez through their emergency communication protocol. No response through official channels. Diane felt the familiar sensation of puzzle pieces assembling into a clear and terrifying picture. The server disruptions, the fake DoD inspection team, the targeting of Eglin Air Force Base communications, and the systematic isolation of internal communications weren't separate incidents. They were coordinated elements of a sophisticated operation designed to compromise Blackstone's most classified weapons technology, while neutralizing the facility's ability to respond effectively to the breach. At 10:24 a.m., the facility's public address system activated with an announcement that confirmed Diane's assessment of the situation. Attention all Blackstone personnel. Due to unexpected DoD safety requirements, the facility is temporarily implementing restricted movement protocols. All employees should remain at their current workstations, while inspection teams complete mandatory evaluations. Normal operations will resume shortly. The announcement sounded official and reassuring, exactly what you'd expect during routine military inspection procedures. But Diane recognized it as a classic control tactic, using legitimate authority and false normalcy to prevent people from recognizing danger until resistance became impossible. She observed the announcement's intended effect throughout the lobby area. Visitors checked their phones and settled into waiting areas, assuming they were experiencing minor administrative delays. Facility employees returned to their workstations, trusting that someone else was handling whatever bureaucratic requirement needed attention. But Diane's military experience had taught her to recognize the precise moment when a situation transitioned from potential threat to active hostile operation. The pattern of disruptions, the timing of communication failures, and the sophisticated coordination of seemingly unrelated events all indicated the same conclusion. Blackstone Defense Contractors was under attack by adversaries who had spent months planning every detail of their operation. At 10:31 a.m., Diane's personal cell phone received a text message from an unknown number. Maintain normal reception duties. Do not attempt to contact external authorities. Cooperation ensures facility security. The message had been sent to her personal device, which meant someone had accessed employee records to obtain contact information. They knew who she was, where she worked, and how to reach her directly. Most importantly, they were monitoring the facility closely enough to observe individual behavior and respond to potential resistance in real time. Diane deleted the message and made a decision that would have been impossible to explain to her colleagues. She was going to treat this as a military operation rather than a civilian emergency. In her experience, sophisticated threats required sophisticated responses. The adversaries clearly had detailed intelligence about Blackstone's operations, employee routines, and security measures. They'd compromised facility systems, isolated communications, and demonstrated access to classified military information. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd dismissed the facility's receptionist as a controllable variable, rather than recognizing her as a trained military specialist with 12 years of experience in exactly these types of scenarios. Diane opened her security portfolio and began implementing the emergency protocols she and Rodriguez had developed during their evening planning sessions. Not the official evacuation procedures that assumed cooperation from facility systems and external authorities, but the practical response plans designed for situations where normal support structures had been compromised. Phase 1. Assess the true scope of the threat and identify adversary capabilities. Phase 2. Establish communication with remaining friendly assets within the facility. Phase 3. Begin defensive operations designed to protect classified materials and neutralize hostile actors. As Diane initiated her response, she felt the familiar calm that came from transitioning from observer to operator. For months, she'd been gathering intelligence and preparing for scenarios that others refused to consider. Now those preparations would determine whether Blackstone's most advanced weapons technology remained secure or fell into hostile hands. The facility's normal Thursday morning continued around her, but Diane Scott was no longer just a receptionist managing visitor access and coordinating meetings. She was a military specialist conducting defensive operations in hostile territory, and the battle for America's most classified weapons technology had officially begun. The question was no longer whether Blackstone was under attack. It was whether the people who dismissed her as just the receptionist had left her with enough resources to mount an effective defense against adversaries who'd planned for every contingency except the one they'd never considered. That their most dangerous opponent was hiding in plain sight behind a reception desk, waiting for exactly this moment to reveal her true capabilities. At 10:37 a.m., Diane made a choice that would define everything that followed. She could continue playing the role of compliant receptionist, following orders from unknown adversaries who clearly had comprehensive plans for controlling the facility and extracting its most valuable secrets. Or she could activate 12 years of military training and treat this situation as what it actually was: a hostile intelligence operation requiring immediate defensive action. The decision crystallized when she observed 4 men in DoD inspection uniforms emerging from the freight elevator near the weapons storage area. These weren't the same individuals from the morning's fake inspection team, but their movement patterns were identical, too coordinated for routine safety inspectors, too purposeful for coincidental timing. They carried equipment cases that moved with the weight distribution of specialized gear rather than standard evaluation tools. Diane recognized the critical moment that every military operative learns to identify, the transition point where gathering information becomes less important than acting on it. She'd spent months documenting threats and building evidence, but evidence was meaningless if no one survived to present it. She activated her phone's video recording function and positioned it to capture the lobby area, then accessed her computer terminal to reach Blackstone's internal systems. Her reception desk workstation had administrative privileges that she'd never utilized, access levels granted because someone had assumed that receptionists would never need anything beyond basic visitor management functions. That assumption was about to prove catastrophically wrong. Diane's first priority was establishing contact with Rodriguez, who represented her only confirmed ally with security access and military experience. The facility's internal phone system remained compromised, but she had a backup communication method developed during their evening intelligence sessions. She accessed Blackstone's emergency alert system, officially designed for fire warnings and evacuation announcements, but actually capable of sending discreet messages to any personnel with appropriate security clearance. Diane composed a message that would appear routine to anyone monitoring communications, but would immediately alert Rodriguez to the true situation. Facilities management, urgent maintenance inspection required. Sublevel 3, multiple system anomalies detected, immediate technical assessment needed. The message used terminology that Rodriguez would recognize as their predetermined code for active hostile operation in progress, implement emergency protocols immediately. Within 2 minutes, her computer screen displayed Rodriguez's response through the same emergency notification system, technical team dispatched. Full diagnostic procedures initiated. Translation, message received, emergency response activated. But Diane's relief was short-lived. At 10:44 a.m., the fake inspection team returned to the lobby, and their demeanor had changed completely. Major Kane no longer projected the professional courtesy of a legitimate military inspector. His movements were sharp, focused, and unmistakably tactical. His 3 colleagues flanked the reception desk with practiced spacing that indicated extensive rehearsal of this specific approach. "Miss Scott," Kane said, his voice carrying new authority and underlying menace, "we need you to make an announcement over the facility's public address system. You'll inform all personnel that the DoD safety evaluation requires temporary suspension of external communications. No cell phones. No internet access. No contact with outside military commands." Diane met his gaze with the calm expression she'd perfected during years of dealing with hostile interrogations in combat zones. "I'll need authorization from facility management before making any announcements that affect normal security operations." Kane's smile was cold and knowing. "Miss Scott, I think we both understand that normal operations ended about 30 minutes ago. You're going to make that announcement because cooperation keeps everyone safe, and resistance creates complications that nobody wants to deal with." The threat was clear, professional, and delivered with the confidence of someone who'd planned for exactly this scenario. But Kane had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd approached Diane as if she were a civilian employee who could be controlled through intimidation and implied violence. Instead, he was facing a combat veteran who'd been threatened by significantly more dangerous people than corporate espionage operatives pretending to be military inspectors. "I understand your position," Diane replied evenly, "but I'm sure you understand that I need to follow proper protocols for any facility-wide announcements." As she spoke, Diane's hands moved with practiced casualness across her desk, activating systems that Kane couldn't observe from his position. She triggered the facility's discrete security alert, not the general alarm that would create panic, but the silent notification that alerted all security personnel to potential threats requiring immediate attention. More importantly, she activated the lockdown protocol for Blackstone's classified storage areas. Not the fake maintenance lockdown that the adversaries had announced, but the real security measure designed to seal the weapons storage levels and protect classified technology during emergencies. Kane's expression shifted as he realized Diane wasn't responding with the fear and compliance that his threats were designed to produce. "Miss Scott, I don't think you're taking this situation seriously enough." "I'm taking it very seriously," Diane said. "That's why I'm not going to help you steal whatever classified technology you're planning to extract from this facility." The moment stretched between them, loaded with the recognition that negotiations had failed and the situation was about to escalate beyond verbal intimidation. Kane's hand moved toward his equipment case, with the deliberate motion of someone accessing weapons they'd hoped not to need. But Diane had been preparing for this exact scenario since her first week at Blackstone Defense Contractors. While Kane was still reaching for his concealed firearm, she was already implementing the defensive protocols that she and Rodriguez had developed during months of planning for sophisticated threats. Her left hand activated the emergency communication system one final time, sending a coded message that Rodriguez would understand immediately. "Fire drill procedures initiated. All safety personnel respond to stations." Translation: active hostile contact confirmed. Initiate combat response protocols. Her right hand moved to the concealed weapon that she'd carried every day for 2 years, secured in a modified compartment of her reception desk that facility security had never detected. Not because they couldn't have found it, but because they'd never considered that their receptionist might need personal protection or have the training to use it effectively. Kane's weapon cleared his equipment case a fraction of a second before Diane's cleared her desk drawer. But fractions of seconds were everything in close-quarters combat, and Diane had spent years training for situations where survival depended on those microscopic advantages. "I need you to reconsider your approach," Diane said, her voice remaining completely calm despite the fact that she was now holding a service pistol in low-ready position. "This facility has security measures that you haven't accounted for, and resistance that you weren't prepared to encounter." Kane stared at her with the shock of someone whose fundamental assumptions about a situation had just been destroyed. He'd planned for cooperative civilians, intimidated employees, and passive compliance from people who'd never faced real violence. Instead, he was looking at a military specialist who'd been conducting counter-surveillance for months and was prepared to defend her position with lethal force if necessary. "You're just a receptionist," Kane said, but his voice carried uncertainty for the first time since entering the facility. "No," Diane replied, maintaining her ready position while calculating distances, angles, and tactical options. "I'm the person who's been watching you plan this operation for weeks. I'm the person who knows exactly how many of you there are, what systems you've compromised, and what you're trying to accomplish. And I'm the person who's going to stop you." Kane's colleagues moved to flank Diane's position, but she'd already anticipated their approach patterns. The reception desk was positioned to provide defensive cover while maintaining sight lines to all lobby entrances. More importantly, her months of studying the facility's architecture had identified exactly how to use the lobby's layout to her tactical advantage. "You can't protect everything," Kane said, trying to regain psychological control of the situation. "This facility has multiple levels and hundreds of personnel. You're one person with limited ammunition facing a coordinated operation that's been planning this for months." Diane smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You're right about one thing," she said. "This has been planned for months. But you weren't the only ones doing the planning." At 10:51 a.m., Blackstone's real security measures activated, not the systems that Kane's team had identified and compromised, but the backup protocols that Diane and Rodriguez had developed independently. Emergency lockdown sealed critical access points. Hidden cameras began recording from angles that the adversaries hadn't detected. And most importantly, discreet alarms reached the few personnel who'd been briefed on the possibility of sophisticated threats requiring military-style responses. Diane had spent 2 years being dismissed as just the receptionist by people who couldn't imagine that someone in her position might have capabilities beyond answering phones and managing visitors. But those same assumptions that had made her invisible to colleagues had also made her invisible to adversaries who'd planned their operation around controlling obvious threats while ignoring hidden ones. The moment of decision was over. Diane Scott was no longer pretending to be a helpless civilian employee, and Blackstone's real defenses were about to reveal themselves to adversaries who'd planned for the wrong enemy entirely. The battle for control of America's most classified weapons technology was about to begin, and both sides were about to discover what happened when months of preparation met the reality of combat between professionals who'd underestimated each other in very different ways. But Diane had one advantage that Kane's team couldn't have anticipated. In exactly 30 seconds, she was going to demonstrate why the Army had trained her to assemble, disassemble, and maintain every weapon system in the American military arsenal faster than anyone thought humanly possible. At 10:52 a.m., Kane made the tactical error that Diane had been anticipating since the moment he'd revealed his weapon. Instead of maintaining his defensive position and calling for backup from his team, he allowed his shock at discovering an armed receptionist to override his operational training. He took a step forward, bringing himself within the critical distance where Diane's close-quarters combat expertise would prove decisive. Diane moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years translating muscle memory into survival. As Kane advanced, she pivoted left behind her reception desk, while simultaneously drawing a tactical baton from her modified desk drawer. The movement was economical, practiced, and completely unexpected by adversaries who'd planned their operation around controlling civilian employees. Kane's first shot went wide, striking the reinforced wall behind Diane's previous position as she rolled behind the reception desk's ballistic-rated structure. But Diane had studied this lobby for 2 years, and she knew something that Kane's reconnaissance team had missed. The reception desk was positioned to provide not just administrative convenience, but tactical cover that could protect against small arms fire while maintaining sightlines to all primary access points. From her covered position, Diane could see Kane's colleagues moving to flank her location using the lobby's architectural columns for concealment. Their movement patterns revealed military training, but also showed they'd planned for a quick intimidation operation rather than sustained combat against a defended position. Diane activated her concealed throat microphone, military communication equipment that she'd disguised as a medical alert device for 2 years. Rodriguez, hostiles engaged in main lobby. 4 armed, military training, attempting to control facility access, initiating defensive protocols. Rodriguez's response came through her nearly invisible earpiece. Copy. Security lockdown complete on all classified levels. Counter-assault team moving to your position. Hold for 3 minutes. 3 minutes was an eternity in close-quarters combat. But Diane had trained for exactly these scenarios during 12 years of military service in environments significantly more dangerous than corporate lobbies. The question wasn't whether she could survive 3 minutes against 4 armed opponents. It was whether she could neutralize the threats before they adapted to her unexpected resistance. Kane made his second crucial mistake by assuming that Diane would remain in a defensive position behind her desk. Instead, she used the lobby's architecture to her advantage, moving laterally along the reinforced wall toward the elevator bank, while maintaining cover behind decorative pillars that provided concealment but not protection. Her movement drew fire from Kane's colleagues, but their shots were hurried and imprecise, the response pattern of people who'd expected intimidation to work and weren't prepared for sustained engagement with a trained opponent. Diane reached the elevator bank and immediately implemented a tactic that her adversaries couldn't have anticipated. She used her administrative access to trap them in the lobby. Quick keystrokes on the elevator control panel locked down all passenger elevators and activated the facility's emergency access restrictions. Kane and his team were now isolated in the lobby, with no rapid escape routes and no way to access the upper levels where their primary objectives waited. More importantly, they were facing an opponent who understood the facility's systems better than they did, and had planned for exactly this type of scenario. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Kane called out, his voice echoing across the lobby. "We just need access to the classified storage areas. Nobody needs to get hurt if you cooperate." Diane's response came from a position he couldn't pinpoint. She'd moved again, using the lobby's sight lines to her advantage. "The only thing you're going to access is federal prison when this is over." Kane's team began a coordinated advance, moving with tactical precision that confirmed their military background. But they were operating in an environment that Diane had studied obsessively, while she remained an unknown variable in their carefully planned operation. It was at 10:54 a.m. that Kane made his final, fatal miscalculation. In his desperation to regain control of the situation, he ordered his team to breach the weapons storage access corridor, not realizing that Diane had been waiting for exactly this moment. As they moved toward the secure entrance, they passed directly by the emergency weapons locker that was concealed behind what appeared to be a decorative wall panel. Diane had discovered this locker during her facility reconnaissance months earlier. It contained military-grade weapons for facility defense during extreme emergencies, weapons that required specialized knowledge to access and operate effectively. The locker was secured with biometric locks that recognized only personnel with appropriate military clearance levels. What Kane's team didn't know was that Diane's clearance was still active in the system, and her fingerprints unlocked an arsenal that included the weapon she'd trained on more extensively than any other during her military career, an M249 squad automatic weapon, better known as the SAW. The security footage would later show exactly what happened next, though witnesses would need to watch it in slow motion to believe what they were seeing. Diane accessed the weapons locker with a single fingerprint scan. The M249 SAW inside had been disassembled for storage according to military protocol. Barrel removed, bolt assembly separated, feed tray detached, stock folded. It looked like a collection of metal components that would take a trained soldier several minutes to assemble into a functional weapon. But Diane Scott wasn't just a trained soldier. She was a master sergeant in Army Ordnance Corps who had taught weapons maintenance to Special Forces units. She held instructor certifications on every small arms system in the American military arsenal. She had assembled M249 SAWs blindfolded, underwater and under enemy fire in conditions that would have broken most soldiers. Kane's team was advancing down the corridor when they heard the distinctive sound of military hardware being manipulated with impossible speed. They turned to see Diane Scott performing what could only be described as mechanical poetry. Her hands moved with surgical precision and inhuman speed. Barrel assembly to receiver, 1.2 seconds. Bolt carrier group insertion and alignment, 0.8 seconds. Feed tray mechanism attachment, 0.9 seconds. Gas system configuration, 0.7 seconds. Stock extension and lock, 0.5 seconds. Belt feed mechanism test, 0.4 seconds. Safety verification, 0.3 seconds. Charging handle operation, 0.2 seconds. Total time, from first component touch to fully operational weapon, 10.3 seconds. Kane's team stood frozen, watching a receptionist transform a pile of metal components into a fully functional light machine gun faster than they would have believed possible if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. But the speed of assembly was only part of what made the moment terrifying. The other part was the absolute calm with which Diane Scott handled the weapon once it was complete. No fumbling with controls, no hesitation about operations, no uncertainty about capabilities. She held the M249 SAW like it was an extension of her own body, which, after 12 years of military service, it essentially was. "Gentlemen," Diane said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had just demonstrated mastery that bordered on superhuman, "I think we need to discuss your surrender options." Kane stared at her with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. He'd planned an operation around controlling a civilian facility, defended by corporate security guards and administrative personnel. Instead, he was facing a military weapons specialist who had just assembled a squad automatic weapon in 10 seconds and was pointing it at his team with the calm competence of someone who'd done this before. "That's impossible," one of Kane's colleagues whispered. "No," Diane replied, making a minor adjustment to the weapon's sight alignment. "That's 12 years of Army Ordnance Corps training. And you're about to find out why the military doesn't train people to assemble weapons that fast, unless they expect them to use those weapons effectively." The lobby fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of the M249's operating system cycling, as Diane performed a functions check that confirmed the weapon was fully operational and ready for sustained automatic fire. Kane's carefully planned operation had just encountered a variable that no amount of reconnaissance could have detected: a master weapons technician who had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal capabilities that would have been impossible to believe if they hadn't just witnessed them firsthand. The 10 seconds that changed everything were over. But the demonstration of what those 10 seconds meant was just beginning, and Kane's team was about to learn why some people are dismissed as just receptionists, right up until the moment when their true expertise becomes the only thing standing between success and catastrophic failure. Rodriguez's voice crackled through Diane's earpiece. "Counter-assault team in position, ready to breach on your signal." Diane smiled, never taking her eyes off Kane's team. "Negative. Situation contained. 4 hostiles requesting immediate surrender. Send cleanup crew instead." The battle for Blackstone's classified technology was over before Kane's team had even realized they were fighting the wrong enemy entirely. At 11:47 a.m., the FBI's Counterintelligence Division arrived with a tactical support unit and digital forensics specialists. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez took one look at the secured scene and immediately sought out the person responsible for preventing what could have been one of the most devastating intelligence breaches in recent military history. "Master Sergeant Scott," Agent Martinez said, using Diane's proper military rank as she extended her hand with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. "Agent Martinez, FBI Counterintelligence, I need to understand exactly how you identified and neutralized this operation." What followed was a comprehensive debriefing that revealed the full scope of both the attack and Diane's response. The 8 captured operatives were part of a sophisticated foreign intelligence network targeting multiple American defense contractors. Their objective had been stealing Project Nightfall specifications during the facility's scheduled weapons testing, when all security attention would be focused on protecting the active demonstrations. Diane's intelligence reports had documented their reconnaissance activities for months. Her disruption of their communication systems had prevented coordination with external support teams. Most critically, her 10-second weapon assembly had stopped the operation before it could access its primary targets: classified technology that represented years of advanced military research. "Master Sergeant Scott," Agent Martinez said after reviewing the evidence, "this is some of the most effective preliminary intelligence work I've seen on a foreign espionage case. Your documentation provided enough detail for us to identify the entire network behind this operation." But the most significant vindication came at 12:15 p.m. when General Patricia Hayes, commander of Army Material Command, arrived at Blackstone Defense Contractors via military helicopter. Despite the morning security crisis, she'd insisted on completing her scheduled evaluation of Project Nightfall after learning that Diane's actions had prevented the theft of technology that could have compromised multiple active military operations. "I need to meet the soldier who saved this program," General Hayes said simply. When Colonel Harrison brought her to the lobby where Diane was completing her statement to federal investigators, General Hayes's response was immediate and unambiguous. "Master Sergeant Scott, I don't know what civilian salary you're currently earning, but I'm prepared to offer you a direct commission to captain and assignment to Army intelligence with immediate effect. We need people with your capabilities protecting our most critical assets." The offer represented not just career advancement, but recognition of Diane's actual value to national security rather than assumptions about her limitations. More importantly, it came from someone who understood that the most dangerous threats were often neutralized by people whose capabilities remained hidden until crisis demanded their revelation. Colonel Harrison's reaction revealed everything about the military culture that had failed to recognize Diane's expertise for 2 years. Instead of pride in discovering extraordinary competence within his command, he displayed territorial concern about losing someone whose value he'd never properly assessed. "Master Sergeant Scott has responsibilities here," Harrison said quickly. "We couldn't possibly release her without proper transition planning and clearance reviews." Diane's response was delivered with the same professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout 2 years of condescension and dismissal, but now backed by the authority of someone whose capabilities had been proven under extreme circumstances. "Colonel Harrison, with respect, my transition plan is simple. You need to hire someone who understands that military experience represents valuable assets, not background noise that can be safely ignored during planning processes." Director Morrison arrived at 12:35 p.m. to find his security department being systematically investigated by federal agents who discovered that his comprehensive security protocols had missed obvious surveillance, ignored credible threat assessments, and failed to detect a months-long intelligence operation conducted by adversaries using basic social engineering techniques. "This is impossible," Morrison protested to Agent Martinez. "Our systems are state-of-the-art. We follow all DoD security standards." "Your systems protected against yesterday's threats," Agent Martinez replied. "Master Sergeant Scott was preparing for tomorrow's threats. That's the difference between security theater and actual security." The federal investigation revealed that Diane's hidden intelligence work had prevented what could have been one of the most successful foreign espionage operations against American military technology in decades. The stolen Project Nightfall specifications would have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars to hostile nations, and the targeting system designs represented strategic capabilities that could have affected global military balance. But perhaps the most telling vindication came from Dr. Richardson, who arrived in the lobby at 12:50 p.m. expecting to find a minor security incident that required administrative attention. Instead, she found federal agents, military personnel, and a crime scene that demonstrated how completely her assumptions about facility security had failed. "Diane," she said, approaching with the hesitant manner of someone who suddenly realized they'd been fundamentally wrong about another person, "I need to apologize. I had no idea about your background, your capabilities, your—" "Dr. Richardson," Diane interrupted gently, "you never asked. For 2 years you assumed I couldn't understand anything more complex than scheduling meetings and processing visitor badges. You never considered that I might have insights worth hearing or expertise worth utilizing." The statement wasn't delivered with anger or accusation, but with the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth to people who demonstrated their inability to recognize competence when it didn't fit their predetermined categories. By 1:30 p.m., the story was spreading throughout every level of Blackstone Defense Contractors. Not the sanitized version that corporate communications would eventually release, but the unfiltered truth that traveled through military networks and defense contractor communities. The Receptionist had prevented a major espionage operation, the executives had missed obvious threats, and assumptions about hierarchy and capability had been spectacularly proven wrong. Dr. Hawthorne's response was perhaps the most revealing. When he learned that Diane had identified security vulnerabilities in his routine that professional security assessors had missed, his first reaction wasn't gratitude for the protection she'd provided, but defensiveness about his own expertise. "I still don't understand how a receptionist could have identified patterns that our security professionals missed," he said to Colonel Harrison. "She's not a receptionist," Harrison replied, finally understanding the magnitude of his own failure to recognize talent. "She's a master sergeant in Army Ordnance Corps with more weapons expertise than most of our engineering staff. She's been conducting professional threat assessment while we assumed she was just answering phones." The transformation rippled beyond individual vindication into broader recognition of systemic failures. General Hayes had ordered a comprehensive review of how military personnel were being utilized in civilian defense positions, after discovering that multiple contractors were unknowingly employing highly trained specialists in administrative roles. "We're wasting human resources on an industrial scale," General Hayes explained during a hastily convened briefing with defense contractor executives. "Master Sergeant Scott's case demonstrates that we're failing to identify and utilize military expertise that's already within our organizations." Rodriguez emerged as another example of misallocated talent. His evening intelligence work with Diane had been conducted on his own initiative, without recognition or support from official security channels. The protocols they developed had proven more effective than Morrison's formal procedures, yet their contributions had been dismissed as unauthorized activity by people who didn't understand professional threat assessment. "We need to completely rethink how we evaluate and utilize personnel," Agent Martinez told the assembled executives. "The most effective intelligence work at this facility was being conducted by people whose capabilities you never bothered to investigate." As afternoon turned to evening, Diane found herself in the unprecedented position of being asked for her professional opinion by the same people who dismissed her insights for 2 years. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what she'd observed, what she'd documented, and what other threats she might have identified. The irony wasn't lost on her that Crisis had been required to reveal competence that should have been obvious through routine professional interaction, but she also recognized an opportunity to influence how military veterans were integrated into defense contractor operations. The problem isn't individual people, Diane explained during a briefing with facility executives and federal investigators. The problem is organizational assumptions about what constitutes valuable experience and how to identify capabilities that don't fit traditional civilian career categories. General Hayes nodded approvingly. Master Sergeant Scott, would you be willing to help us develop better integration protocols for military personnel transitioning to defense contractor positions? Diane considered the request carefully. She could accept the offered commission and return to active military service, vindicated and properly recognized. Or she could work to ensure that other veterans wouldn't face the same dismissal and underutilization that she'd experienced. General, I'd be honored to help develop those protocols, but I think the most effective approach would be creating systems that identify and utilize existing talent, rather than just improving future hiring practices. The facility that had dismissed her as just the receptionist would never be the same. And neither would the defense contracting industry, which was about to learn that some of their most valuable assets had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to recognize that expertise doesn't always announce itself through traditional credentials or conventional career paths. Diane Scott was no longer invisible, but more importantly, she'd established precedents that would help other veterans avoid the professional dismissal that had defined her own experience, until the moment when Crisis revealed what competence really looked like under pressure. 6 months later, Captain Diane Scott stood in the Pentagon's secure briefing room, reviewing threat assessments for defense contractors across 3 continents with the same methodical attention that had once been dismissed as overprotective reception work. The brass nameplate on the conference table read, Captain D. Scott, Director of Contractor Security Integration. But the transformation went far deeper than rank insignia or security clearances. The woman who had once hidden intelligence reports in appointment books now commanded a budget of $18 million and supervised protective operations for Fortune 500 defense contractors across multiple time zones. But more importantly, she worked within a system that valued her insights rather than dismissing them, that sought her analysis rather than ignoring it, and that understood the difference between competence and assumptions about competence. Mayus, Captain Scott, General Hayes said as she entered the briefing room with Admiral Patricia Chen, who had become the Navy's liaison for contractor security after the Blackstone incident exposed vulnerabilities across multiple service branches. The State Department briefing confirmed what your threat assessment predicted. The foreign intelligence network that targeted Blackstone was part of a coordinated campaign against 12 different American defense facilities. Diane nodded, making notes in a leather portfolio that no longer needed to be disguised as anything other than what it was: professional documentation by a recognized expert in defense contractor security. The pattern analysis suggested coordination beyond single-target operations. Have they identified the other intended victims? 15 major contractors, including 6 that handle next-generation fighter aircraft technology, Admiral Chen replied. The Defense Intelligence Agency estimates that your disruption of the Blackstone operation prevented potentially billions in stolen intellectual property and compromised multiple active military programs. But Diane's satisfaction came not from the scale of the threat she'd prevented, but from working within an environment where threat assessment was valued before crisis materialized, rather than dismissed until disasters proved their necessity. The transformation of her professional life had been dramatic, but the institutional changes ran even deeper. She no longer needed to arrive early to conduct surveillance that others couldn't imagine, or stay late to document patterns that others wouldn't acknowledge. Instead, she managed teams of former military intelligence professionals who understood that the most dangerous threats were often those that looked like routine business operations. Her staff meetings were attended by people who'd served in Army Counterintelligence, Navy Criminal Investigative Service, and Air Force Office of Special Investigations. They analyzed emerging threats with the same methodical precision that Diane had brought to her hidden evening sessions with Rodriguez. But now their work was supported by unlimited resources and direct access to classified intelligence networks. Rodriguez had joined her team as Senior Security Coordinator, bringing his practical knowledge of facility protection and his understanding of how corporate environments could be exploited by determined adversaries. Together, they developed security protocols that were being implemented by major defense contractors who'd learned that traditional approaches were inadequate against sophisticated threats. The consulting request from Northrop Grumman came in this morning, Rodriguez mentioned during their weekly briefing. They want us to conduct a complete security evaluation for their new hypersonic weapons facility. Apparently, they've identified some concerning patterns in their personnel access logs. Diane considered the strategic implications of working with Northrop Grumman, one of the largest defense contractors in the world. Schedule a preliminary assessment meeting. They need better security integration, and we can provide it. Previous institutional failures don't change current responsibility to protect national assets. The request from Northrop was part of a broader transformation that had rippled through the defense contracting industry. Diane's successful prevention of the Blackstone operation had demonstrated that traditional security approaches were inadequate against emerging threats, and her subsequent work had established new standards for proactive threat assessment across the entire sector. She'd been invited to speak at classified briefings where audiences included executives who'd once dismissed military personnel as administrative overhead. Her presentations focused not on personal vindication, but on the systematic failures that allowed competent people to be overlooked while incompetent people retained authority over critical security decisions. The most dangerous assumption in contractor security, she would tell audiences of executives and security professionals, is that threats will announce themselves clearly and that competence can be identified through job titles rather than demonstrated through performance under pressure. The transformation had extended beyond Diane's individual success to influence how the entire defense industry approached both security and personnel utilization. The Pentagon had implemented policies requiring that all contractor employees' military backgrounds be reviewed for relevant experience that might be underutilized, regardless of their current job functions. The results had been remarkable across the industry. They'd discovered a facilities manager with electronic warfare experience, an accounting clerk with cryptographic expertise, and a maintenance supervisor with explosive ordnance disposal certification that proved invaluable for detecting surveillance equipment. Companies were realizing that people brought their entire professional histories to work, and those histories represented assets that could either be capitalized upon or wasted through organizational ignorance. People carry their complete skill sets to every position, Diane had explained to Secretary of Defense Morrison during the policy development process. We can either recognize and utilize that experience, or waste it by making assumptions about what people can contribute based on what we've asked them to do rather than what they're capable of accomplishing. The principle had become central to the Pentagon's competitive advantage in industries where foreign adversaries continued to underestimate American capabilities precisely because they made the same assumptions about hierarchy and competence that had nearly cost Blackstone its most classified technology. Diane's transformation had also included a personal reckoning with her own choices during the years of professional invisibility. She'd proven that concealing extraordinary capabilities in ordinary positions could serve strategic purposes, but she'd also learned that accepting systematic undervaluation carried costs beyond personal satisfaction. During a recent interview with the Defense News that was profiling her transition from receptionist to Pentagon director, Diane had been asked whether she regretted the years of being dismissed and underestimated. "I regret that it required a national security crisis to demonstrate competence that should have been recognized through normal professional evaluation," she'd replied. "But I don't regret the experience of observing how organizations function when they think they're not being monitored by anyone whose opinion matters. That perspective informed my approach to building security systems that account for human assumptions, as well as technological vulnerabilities." That perspective had become the foundation for security protocols that assumed adversaries would exploit expectations about who deserved attention and who could be safely ignored. Her systems were designed around the recognition that the most dangerous threats often came from people who looked exactly like legitimate personnel until the moment they revealed their true intentions. The broader impact of Diane's story had reached beyond defense contracting into academic discussions about organizational psychology and talent recognition. Business schools were incorporating case studies about the Blackstone incident into curricula about identifying and utilizing hidden competencies within existing workforce structures. Military academies were using her story to teach cadets about the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of its current organizational context. The lesson was clear. Competence doesn't always announce itself through traditional channels, and the most valuable assets might be hiding in plain sight until crisis reveals their true capabilities. Hi, fool. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was personal. Diane no longer needed to compartmentalize her professional identity or accept roles that required her to be less than her full capabilities. She worked with people who understood her background, valued her insights, and expected her to contribute at the highest levels of her training and experience. The woman who had once been just the receptionist now sat in classified briefings with Pentagon leadership, defense contractor executives, and allied military intelligence specialists, who sought her analysis of emerging threats to American technological superiority. Her insights shaped policies that protected billions of dollars in defense assets and thousands of jobs across multiple industries. Yet Diane maintained the same methodical approach that had characterized her work at Blackstone. She still arrived early, still conducted thorough preparation, still documented observations with precision that reflected military training. The difference was that now these habits were recognized as professional excellence rather than dismissed as excessive attention to administrative detail. On quiet evenings in her Pentagon office, Diane would sometimes reflect on the path that had led from invisible receptionist to recognized expert in defense contractor security. The transformation hadn't required her to become someone different. It had required others to see who she'd always been beneath their assumptions about what receptionists could or should contribute to national security. The nameplate on her desk now read, Captain Diane Scott, Director of Contractor Security Integration, U.S. Army. But the real transformation was that she no longer needed nameplates or titles to define her worth. She learned that competence spoke for itself when people were willing to listen, and that the most valuable recognition came from colleagues who understood excellence rather than those who needed crisis to reveal it. Sometimes the people we overlook aren't waiting for permission to be extraordinary. They're already extraordinary, waiting for the moment when their readiness meets institutional recognition that ordinary assumptions about talent and capability are often completely wrong. Diane Scott had always been ready. The defense industry had finally caught up. The 10 seconds that assembled a machine gun had become a symbol, but the real story was about the years of preparation that made those 10 seconds possible, and the institutional changes that ensured other veterans would never again need a national security crisis to prove their worth. In conference rooms across the Pentagon, defense contractors were learning that their most valuable assets might be sitting behind reception desks, managing facilities, or processing paperwork, waiting for someone to ask the right questions about what they could really accomplish when their country needed them most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.